so I don't read too much into this, this most recent statement. But I think clearly there's been some progress made, especially compared to the previous visit by Zelensky to the White House, which ended much more, I think, in a complicated, to say the least, way. So now the devil will be in the details in terms of the follow-up. It does look like there are plans in place for either a bilateral between Putin and Zelensky and/or a trilateral between Putin, Zelensky, and Trump. So we'll have to see what comes out of that. But certainly, I think Zelensky can feel pretty good about what happened today.
Let's take a little more stock about this historic meeting. As you said, this seemed to go significantly better than the meeting earlier this year. And also, let's talk about Trump's meeting in Alaska with Vladimir Putin. European leaders at this meeting made it clear that they would like to have some kind of ceasefire, or at least some kind of protection, some kind of guarantee that there is going to be security. And in dealing with Putin, critics claim that Trump really received little or nothing in the way of concessions from Vladimir Putin while he was in Alaska. Your take on that?
Well, this is obviously a very difficult negotiation process. I think there have been some moderation of positions by both Trump and Putin, especially when you compare where they stood even just a few months ago. So I think even this issue of security guarantees, while Trump has made clear that NATO membership, at least for the foreseeable future, is off the table for Ukraine. At the same time, he did, indicate that the U.S. would be a part of some level of backing, from a security perspective, in order to reach a deal. Now, things like territory exchange, that's going to be a lot more difficult, and I think that could be, one of the snags, before a peace agreement is reached. And the ceasefire, I mean, that's been Putin's position all along, that he wants something kind of more comprehensive, whereas the Europeans want to see the proof that Russia will actually abide by it. So again, these are things that will likely be hammered out in the coming weeks as these meetings unfold.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right on those. But let's talk about the exchanges between Zelensky and Trump, the way that President Trump treated Zelensky, and also the way that Trump treats Putin in Alaska. What's your take on that? He seems almost, I wouldn't say in awe, but just the way he rolled out the red carpet, called him Vladimir, and then very professional, I would say, in his talks with the Ukrainian leader.
Yeah, I think that Trump is essentially treating both President Putin and President Zelensky similarly, which obviously is not how Ukraine or the Europeans would prefer it. But I think Trump is looking to make a deal, and that means dealing with both countries kind of where they're at, and that includes Russia. I believe there was reports of even Trump calling Putin at some point during today's meetings with Ukraine and the Europeans. So he's essentially trying to get it done. He's got the leverage, the U.S. does, against both Russia with the threat of the things like sanctions and secondary tariffs. I think that's part of why Putin ended up coming to Alaska in the first place. But he's also got the leverage on Ukraine and being able to withdraw some of that military support. So I think he's treating them essentially equally with the hopes of getting a deal.
Okay, what message did the presence of all the European leaders really send? And how do you think Putin is going to react to this phone call between Trump and the Russian leader?
Well, I think the message was to distinguish between what happened last time during Zelensky's visit, which was obviously more confrontational and just kind of one-on-one. This time, much more positive, much more constructive, and having the Europeans at the table with Ukraine and with the U.S., of course, as well. So this is sending a message, I think, after the Alaska meeting, which seemed to go well but didn't lead to a breakthrough, that that the U.S. does have the Europeans behind it, that the U.S. is not going to simply abandon Ukraine.
Right.
But at the same time, they're willing to negotiate.
And what about the demands that are coming from the most prominent European leaders right now, such as the UK, Germany, and France, on a deal to end the war? What is their number one priority? Obviously, peace would be that, but ceasefire, or do you think they're going to lean on Zelensky in any way to consider surrendering a certain amount of territory?
I think from the European perspective, the number one priority is getting security guarantees, not only for Ukraine, but also for the European countries themselves, obviously, because they're there, right? So they're concerned about any potential Russian action going further in Ukraine and potentially even beyond. So the ceasefire, I think, is more a means to an end to get those security guarantees. And this, I think, is something that Trump has signaled that the U.S. will be involved in to some extent or another. It won't involve NATO membership for Ukraine, obviously, but for security guarantees, I think this is something that the U.S. will be involved in.
Eugene, earlier you talked about the United States having a certain amount of leverage over Trump. What do you make of Trump's statements before his meeting with Putin, that the U.S. would hit Russia with more sanctions if Russia didn't work toward a ceasefire and an end to hostilities. Because Trump didn't look like he was taking an incredibly hardline stance with Putin while he was in Anchorage.
Right. I think, during the meetings themselves, I think Trump is trying to get this deal in place, and he realizes that this is a difficult thing to do. So part of that is offering, carrots, so to speak, and the other part is offering the potential, stick. In this case, he wanted the meeting to go well with Putin, but he had, I would argue, a similarly, a constructive meeting with Ukraine and the Europeans. But sending, Putin a message that if these talks break down, if the military operations continue or increase, then that threat of economic pressure is a real one.
Eugene, quickly, your headline. What's your takeaway from the last 4 days?
Takeaway is that there's movement happening. We're still not at a deal, and it still could, fall apart. But I would say that overall from the past 4 days, we've seen progress, and we'll really see how significant that is in terms of the coming weeks, in terms of the meeting and the results from those meetings.
Eugene Chausovsky, thank you so much for your insight. We appreciate it.
Thank you.